Hey everybody, how you doing? This is Kevin Gallagher. It's a pleasure to have you here. We're here every single Friday night at 8:30 p.m., every Monday morning at 11 a.m. If you're watching us on Comcast Channel 23, if you're watching us on the web, you could be watching us when we're live, and we're taping these usually on a Wednesday night around 6 p.m. And so if it's around that time, adjust for the time zone, of course, that you're in, because I'm Eastern time, you're seeing us live. And if you're watching us live on on YouTube or on Facebook or on Twitch, you can use the chat function and you can ask our myself or our guests questions. We'll be here till 7 p.m. Eastern. And folks, thank you for tuning in and watching us. We just passed, by the way, our 25th anniversary of being on the air. That was back on October 10th. We went on the air in 1996. And things sure have changed. We now tape the show using the internet, going over the internet to do the program. And my guests, for the most part, I've always been kind of far away. I have one guy that's out in Pennsylvania, and my other guest tonight is in Los Angeles. So we're going to be talking about some interesting stuff. And as we are getting ready to go into the holiday season, this is something I want to really kind of look at, because it's something that we think we know a whole lot about, but we don't really know as much as we think we do. So we're going to be looking at the life and the times surrounding the time of the birth of Christ. And the first thing that we're going to be looking at tonight are those people that we call the Magi. Now, the Magi are the people that you traditionally hear talked about in that whole setup with the three wise men, and they were there, they were this, they were that, they sing songs about it, whatever. But we're going to find out what the actual reality is versus what the Christian tradition is, or as one of my guests likes to say, the Christian mythology. And it's very interesting. And even if you're not a Christian, I think you're going to find this program extremely enlightening and really interesting. So first up, we have Tim Keys. Tim, I want to say thank you for joining us here today, and just tell people a little bit about yourself, and we'll go from there.
Well, absolutely. My name is Tim Keys. I live outside of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and I have been an amateur theologian for about 35 years. And my main project that I've been doing for that entire time, I now entitle it God Save the King, but it is, frankly, a documentary about the birth of Jesus Christ, about the Nativity. I started looking at the Nativity back in the mid-'80s and realized, oh my word, the traditional Nativity story that we think we know is just not supported by the Bible. So I said, well, what does it look like? What does the story really go like? And that was 35 years ago, and now it is my primary focus. And I love helping people realize that the story is really, truly amazing. I mean, the Nativity story, the traditional version is kind of cool, but this one's even better. It's bigger in scale and much more epic and truly amazing, and I love sharing it with people.
That's excellent. That's excellent. Michael Parker, I just met a few minutes ago for the first time. And so, Michael, share with us a little bit about yourself, and then we'll get right into the subject matter.
Well, I am originally from Texas. I've lived here in Los Angeles since the early 90s. And like Tim, I am a seeker. And through Tim, I've learned some things about Christianity that I did not know. I had the pleasure and honor of joining him on a television series that was done for Parables, .tv or .net. I'm not sure if it's either.
TV.
But anyway, yeah. And we did 8 episodes, and Tim really educated me a lot on this thing. It's funny when he calls it the Christian mythology, because I did not know to what extent this was a mythology. And for me personally, I have been a musician most of my life, and actually that's how Tim and I met, is our love of music. And then after that, we learned that we both had these interests in spiritual matters and finding out the truth about a lot of different things. And I've worked in internet radio and podcasting and new media since the early 2000s. And I live here in LA. I've been here a long time, and right now we could use some truth.
Yeah, it's much needed, isn't it?
Yes, it is.
Yeah. And so, what is it about the traditional nativity scene that we're all taught that's, as what you're saying, is all wrong? It differs completely from reality. Who wants to take that question?
Everything.
Everything.
It's amazing how much of the traditional nativity story I have discovered over the years is incorrect. Now, initially, I didn't realize that. How I got introduced to this whole big project that I'm working on now, the introduction was very simply, oh, well, he wasn't born on December 25th.
Mhm.
So when I started investigating that, it was with the unconscious assumption that maybe his birth date changed, but the story didn't really change. That didn't even occur to me initially. I just thought, oh, okay, he was born on a different date, right? But then once I realized when he was born accurately and what it meant biblically, okay, and according to the Hebrew tradition, he was born on a Jewish feast day.
Yeah.
What happened as a result is I started realizing, maybe this wasn't exactly like that. And then what happened is just over time, I was discovering errors, and then I'd correct that error. And then once I would correct an error, that would reveal another error, and so on and so on and so on, until
Right.
I've gotten to the point now where I know it's got to freak people out when I do it. But when they ask me, I go, yeah, everything about it is wrong. He wasn't born in a stable. The Magi and the shepherds weren't there on the same night. Mary didn't ride on a donkey, and the list goes on.
Yeah. So, we're focusing tonight on the Magi.
Mm-hmm.
So, who exactly were these people? What's so special about them that they, got kind of mentioned out? They got called out in the Bible. There has to be a significance to who they are.
Sure. Well, if you read the infancy narrative in the Gospel of Matthew, beginning in chapter 2, it says, that in the days of Herod the king, these wise men from the east came to Jerusalem, and they met Herod in the court of Herod the Great, and they apparently just walked in and said, "Where is he who is born the King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east, and we have come to worship him." And that's how we're introduced to what we call the Magi. It's the wise men in English, and it's the word Magian in Greek. And, we're going to talk all about exactly what that means. But that's the introduction we have is, boom, out of nowhere, Gospel of Matthew, wise men from the east saw his star. Where is he who is born King of the Jews? That's how we're introduced to him. So therefore, that leads to very logical questions of, well, who are these guys? What did they see in the sky? We saw his star. What did they see? How did they know what to look for? He who is born King of the Jews, how did they know it was connected to a Judean king if they came from 600 miles to the east, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera?
Yeah, exactly. So now, who were they? And let's just discover who these people actually were. What's their history, their background?
Well, if you go back about 600 to 700 years before Christ, there was an empire, a kingdom, primarily on the southwest shore of the Caspian Sea called Media. Okay, the Median Empire, and according to Herodotus, the among the Medes, one of their dominant tribes was called the Magians or the Magians, okay? And the Magians became the Median hereditary priesthood, very similar to the way the Levites became the hereditary priesthood of the nation of Israel. So that's how they became notable initially. Like I said, 600-700 BC-ish. The Magians were simply the hereditary priesthood of the Median Empire, and then as you move forward in time, see, they developed, and then they became known for their pretty extraordinary, I'll call it metaphysical knowledge, okay? Because they were into they were the wise men. They really were the wise men. They were the royal tutors, so they did teach things like mathematics and science and stuff like that. But what they truly became known for was they became astronomers, and they became dream interpreters, and they eventually oversaw royal succession. And their big thing and how it all fits into our story. And I'm condensing this quickly because we only have an hour, because we could do this for days.
Yeah.
Is that in their heyday, in their peak, what they were known for is they gave a daily intelligence briefing to the king.
Wow.
That's what they did. That's what they were known for, is that they would consult the scrolls, they would consult the stars, they'd consult the genealogies, they would gather up all this information, and then they would go into the king and say, okay, here's your intelligence briefing for today on how to run the empire and decisions.
You're sparking a question off in my mind here, which is, did these guys work then with more than one king? And did they have, for lack of a better way of putting it, did they have offices, around in different countries that they operated in, or were they in just one country?
Well, no, so over time, so let me do this quickly, right? So they began as a tribe among the kingdom of the Medes, right? But as you move forward in time, see, the Babylonians conquered the Medes.
Yes.
So then when the Babylonians conquered the Medes, the Magians, they became the hereditary priesthood of the Babylonian Empire. Okay. Well, then the Persians conquered the Babylonians. All right. And so they became the hereditary priesthood of the Persian Empire. And then the Greeks conquered the Persians. Now, they didn't become the hereditary priesthood of the Greeks, but the Greeks nonetheless valued this kind of knowledge. So under the Greeks, what happened is prior to the Greeks, they were primarily a consolidated body, primarily in one kingdom, although they would be scattered around the kingdom, like in different cities, right? So if we talk about in the Babylonian Empire, for example, yes, there would have been Magi in Babylon. Yes, there would have been Magi in Baghdad. There would have been Magi in Ctesiphon. There would have been Magi in Sippar. All these different Babylonian cities would have had Magi there to do their job. But of course, a preeminent number of them would have been in the court of the king. But under the Greeks, what happened is the Magi tended to, for lack of a better word, kind of get scattered. And because the Greek Empire was so vast, right? Now you have Magi in Alexandria, Egypt. You have Magi in Damascus. You have Magi in Pergamum. You've got Magi in, all over the place in what we would now call Kandahar, which is in Afghanistan. You would have had Magi everywhere, scattered all over, because the ancient world really valued this kind of knowledge, and they would bring these men to their court or send their best and brightest to the east to study with the Magi. Pythagoras, the Greek mathematician Pythagoras, went to the east to study with the Magi.
That's very interesting. Michael, what would you like to add to this to this discussion?
Well, it's one of the things that I think about when I started learning all this, because we do have this simplistic view of the nativity. We have this simplistic view of the wise men, when in fact, the wise men, the Magi, are what I like to think of as what created the ancient world, because there are your strong men, there are your rulers, but then there's the brains behind the operation, right? And that's what I've learned from Tim. That's what these guys were. And we have a joke when we were making the show that the Magi kind of cornered the market on esoteric and scientific knowledge, and they imparted that to the various parties and the various countries that they dealt with, and they were so widely respected that it didn't matter which country conquered which. The Magi still had a job, right? And they were kept around to teach the young of the royal families, to advise the rulers through their dream interpretation, through reading the stars, through just their knowledge of the political climate of the time. These were ingenious men of yore. And one of the things that I remember the most when Tim and I were working on the show was this picture in my mind, which blew my mind. And I hope I'm not jumping the gun too much, Tim, but this is what I always think of about the Magi, is we think of there being three of them.
Yeah.
Because that's what we've been told. When in fact, as Tim just explained, they're now populated throughout these various countries. And when they came to see Herod, there wasn't three of them. There was there were hundreds. Entourage. And they were, an entourage. And so that's how these guys operated. They were the power behind the throne, almost in a way that like Tyrion or Targaryen, I can't think of in the Game of Thrones.
Right.
These were the guys who, they really were the power behind the throne.
Yeah, and I can remember from the Gospels, it talks about there being a great uproar in the city when they appeared, and 3 guys showing up wouldn't cause an uproar.
Correct. Right. Absolutely correct.
Even if they were clothed in finery, which these men probably were, yeah, you'd be like, okay, some rich guys rolled in, and then it wouldn't be a thing. So clearly that's not right.
Yeah, it's interesting. Now, one thing I'll share with you guys before we move forward, and people can check this out on the web. You can go to timeoutyoutube.com. That is the, you can go to timeoutyoutube.com. You can also just type that in and you'll get to the YouTube page for the TV show. It's just an easy way to do it instead of that long URL that YouTube will give you. And then look for a playlist called Sting of the Scorpion. And what that is, it took me 2.5 years, guys, to put together, and it's in 14 parts, 30 minutes each, and it covers how the Word of God is written in the sky. And it goes over the star names, the constellations, and a lot of what we're talking about tonight fits into that. So if you want to get some more backgrounding on the information that we're talking about tonight, what you might want to do is watch those in order all the way through 1 through 14, and you'll get a really good education overview about star names, their meanings, and what it is that the Magi saw that freaked them out enough to make hundreds of miles a trip to Israel, because they knew that somebody was born just by looking at the stars. So, Tim, where would you like to continue from here?
Well, what I need to do is finish a little bit about their origin.
Sure.
Because, like we said, initially they were one tribe among the Medes. Then the Babylonians conquer the Medes. The Persians conquer the Babylonians. The Greeks conquer the Persians. But then the Greek Empire, because it was so massive,
right?
Once Alexander died, Alexander divided it up under his 5 strongest generals, which quickly became his 4 strongest generals, because one got defeated. And then Seleucus, who inherited what we would call today the Middle East, right? He had the biggest stretch of land to control, and it didn't take very long where he just couldn't control it any longer. It was too big. So in all that area that he had to control, there was a province at the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea called Parthia. And Parthia broke free and declared their independence. And then over the next 200 years, they steadily moved west and consumed Alexander's empire in the Middle East until the 1st century BC. Okay, that's when, with the Parthians moving east and Rome moving west, they ran into each other, with Israel right on the frontier between these 2 superpowers of the day.
Wow.
So that brings us up to the time of Christ. And under the Parthian Empire, the Magi became consolidated again. And the Magi were literally the second house. The Parthians were one of the first governments we're aware of that had something resembling a parliamentary system. They had 2 houses. You had the upper house, which was the royals and the nobles, and then you had the lower house, which was the Magi. They were called the House of Magistanes. Okay, so, and when a royal would die, see, one of the things that the Parthians did that was very unusual in the ancient world is they did not practice the right of primogeniture. So the right of primogeniture was simply when the king would die, his oldest son would become the next king, right? So the Parthians didn't do that, okay? Which was very unusual. What they did is when the king died, it was the Magi, the House of Magistanes, who determined who the next king would be. That was in their job description. They would consult the scrolls, the genealogies, and the stars, and then they would declare who the next king was.
Interesting. Now, not to jump ahead, but is that something along the lines of Herod? Because Herod, I always thought of was kind of more like a governor
Well,
if to put it in modern terminology, rather than a king, because he was appointed.
well, right. Well, Herod was what we would call a client king. Okay. What the Romans did as often as they could is they were brutal. Make no mistake. They were a brutal, domineering force, right? But as often as they could, if they could have a local ruler be a vassal and rule the country in their name, they would do that instead of bringing in a foreign, or literally a Roman governor, right? So by the time of Jesus's earthly ministry, Jesus as an adult, we have the Roman governor Pontius Pilate, okay? Because by that time, Judea was a province of the Roman Empire, okay? So they had a Roman governor. But prior to Judea being a Roman province, Judea was what's known as a client kingdom, okay? So it was run by a local, in this case, pseudo-ethnic ruler who ran it for the Romans, okay? Now, Herod was not a Judean, and yes, he was appointed by the Romans, but he was the king of Judea. He was declared king of Judea by the Romans.
Interesting. So, Michael, where do you want to take it from here?
Well, another thing about the Magi that interests me a great deal and is their dream interpretation skills. And that figures into the story with Herod as well. And just the idea of interpreting dreams being I don't want to say a hard science, but a respected science in that day. I mean, these guys were, for human beings, they almost had a supernatural quality about them to be able to read the stars and interpret dreams. And then in the case of the Parthians, also to appoint kingship. I mean, that's a big deal. That's not something you let ordinary people do. And it makes me wonder, okay, so if I'm interpreting dreams, where does that symbology come from that I am then turning into a language which, I can explain to a king or a governor or whomever, okay, based upon what you just told me, that it just means this. So these men, and I don't know if there were women Magi, I perhaps there were, I don't want to be sexist, but where that information came from, how it was developed, and that amazes me. Tim, you should tell them about the dream and the trip to see the baby or the young Jesus, so they didn't return to Herod.
Yeah, well, it's really amazing that you bring that up, because today, unless you're someone like the three of us who has interest in these very esoteric things and in straight up biblical knowledge, I mean, I became interested in dreams for two primary reasons. One, the Bible says God speaks to people in dreams. And you can't argue with that. It's all through the Bible.
Right.
Believers, unbelievers, Old Testament, New Testament, Jew, Gentile, Church of God. He speaks to everybody in dreams. So
and not to interrupt, but Pontius Pilate's wife had the dream.
Had a dream
about Jesus.
About Jesus, exactly. So if you have even a basic understanding of Scripture, you look at it and say, "Oh my God, this is everywhere."
Yeah,
it's everywhere in the Bible. Are people having dreams? So that was one of the things that interested me in dreams, even apart from God Save the King and the Magi. But that's, of course, is the second thing, is that I noticed one of the people groups that God spoke to was he spoke to the Magi, because once they had found the young child Jesus, Scripture very clearly tells us that God spoke to them in a dream and said, "Don't go back to Herod, return to your country another way," which is just absolutely stunning. But what I came to discover over time as a result of delving into this is that, once again, in the ancient world, Michael, you hinted at this, in the ancient world, this was a much more important thing. The wise men of the ancient world, both in the East and in the West, were very interested in dreams, especially dreams involving royalty, because they believed that was the gods or God on the move in the life of the rulers of these kingdoms, unquestionably. And it's really striking to see the number of dreams involved in the nativity story, not only with the Magi, but then also with Joseph, the adopted father of Jesus. He's warned by God at least twice, I think maybe even 3 times in a dream to take action regarding his new family.
It's interesting. So what is it that these guys saw that caused them to pack up their donkeys, pack up their camels or whatever, and make that long
Horses.
trip?
It would have been by the way, it would have been horses. Okay.
Okay.
The that culture was a horse culture. Okay.
Okay.
If you think in your mind of that very classic traditional picture of the mounted archer, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Who is he's actually turned backwards in his saddle and he's firing the bow this way. That's the Parthians. Okay.
Okay.
When the Parthians met the Romans in battle, they were one of the only nations or empires to ever fight Rome to a standstill. And it was because they had this super fast moving light cavalry, okay, these mounted archers, and that's what they were known for. So
they were lethal.
It was a horse culture, and ironically, heavy cavalry was armored camels. Okay, so I've actually got a picture of one, a mock-up of an armored camel, which is pretty striking. But anyway, the question was, what did they see? Okay,
yeah, what did they see?
So there's 2 different theories, one that is relatively complete, and then one that I am working on that is very incomplete, right? Now, the one theory, okay, is that because we talked about the history of the Magi, starting with the Medes, then the Babylonians, Persians, etc., right? When Daniel, the Hebrew prophet Daniel, was a captive in Babylon, here we go. Nebuchadnezzar had a dream, and Daniel interpreted it. And because of his demonstrated ability to interpret dreams, Nebuchadnezzar appoints him Rab-Mag, which in Hebrew means the chief of the Magi. Okay? It's right there in the Bible. Daniel was the chief of the Magi. And so one theory, which I think is the most likely the case, is that Daniel imparted to the Magi his knowledge of Judean archaeoastronomy. In other words, how the Jews looked at the stars and interpreted the stars. Okay.
Interesting.
So, and that's what you mentioned, your the work that you had done, where and I can do it too, where you can look at the constellations, look at their names, look at the star names in Hebrew, and each constellation tells a story. Okay. So if you start with Virgo, the virgin, right? Gee, any virgins in the gospel? Oh yeah, there's this one famous one named Mary, right? And then you start with the brightest star with the Spica, and then you go to the second brightest star and the third brightest star, and you follow them down in their order of luminescence with their names in Hebrew. It tells you a story. Okay. Yeah. So, so that's one theory behind that. Daniel imparted that knowledge to the Magi, and then a subset of the Magi retained that knowledge for the next 500-600 years. Okay. And that's how they knew what to see. Now, the other theory, however, that I'm working on is, how did Babylonian astronomy work? What were they looking for? Okay, because I have a sneaking suspicion that it wasn't exclusively Judean astronomy. I got a feeling that they overlapped, and that's what made the Parthian Magi go, oh my God, not only is this what Daniel said, but this fits with what we've been studying for centuries, right? It's just because I've seen how Jehovah Sneaky does stuff sometimes. I'm really curious to that, because also, see, when the Magi showed up at the court of Herod, they said, where is he who is born King of the Jews? For we have seen his star in the east. Now, in Greek, that phrase, in the east, is scientific. It's astronomical. Okay. It really means in the rising. We have seen his star in the rising. Okay.
And what does that mean to the people watching?
Okay. Well, in the rising means just like the rising sun. Okay. Stars rise above the horizon just like the sun does. It's just that if the sun is below the horizon, right, and you're watching the eastern sky, well, look at this. All of a sudden, a star goes whoop, just like the sun does. It's just that it's a star instead of the sun, right?
Tim, if I could throw some,
please go ahead.
If I could just throw something in, when we're talking about the ancient civilizations and these mystery traditions, and just listen, back then there was no television, there was no computers, there was no internet. Every night when you went to bed, you stared at the sky, and so all across the planet. And I would guess that the Magi and the more advanced cultures throughout, the Chinese or whomever, they, as through their travels, through their trade, I got some information from these guys, I got some information from these guys over here. We put all this together, we begin to transcribe it, we begin to contrast and compare. And I would think people as wise as the Magi, they probably just like Tim said, they were hybridizing and taking in information from as many cultures as they could to expand their own knowledge. And I would just think that, they listened. They didn't just tell people things, they listened.
And Michael, you reminded me of something that's actually very important that we tend to forget, okay? And I forgot it myself 20 minutes ago when I was giving you the history of the Magi. Yes, the Parthian Empire started on the east end of the Caspian Sea and moved west. But that doesn't mean that the Magi only went to the west. The Magi also went to the east. And so there would have been Magi in the courts of the Kushan and Han dynasties in India and in China. They would have had Magi in their courts as well. We forget that in this day and time, that was the known world, not Europe, not the Western Empire. It was the Eastern Empire that was the known world. And when the Magi traveled from Ctesiphon, which was their capital, right? So I believe that's where they would have come from in the Parthian Empire, was either Ctesiphon or Sippar. And I've got reasons for why those two cities, right? They would have traveled northwest following the Euphrates River until they got to the town of what is called Rasafa in modern Syria, right, where they would have crossed the Euphrates and they would have intersected the King's Highway that then would have taken them southwest through Damascus and then to Caesarea first, because Caesarea was Herod's political capital. So they would have went to Caesarea first, and when they realized that Herod wasn't in Caesarea, that's when they went to Jerusalem to meet him at his court there. But the reason I tell you what I just did is because those roads were part of a network that ran from Upper Mesopotamia and the Levant and Egypt all the way to the Far East. It would eventually become known as the Silk Road. So it's this massive networks of trade routes that ran all the way from Mesopotamia to the Far East. So unfortunately, we're very narrow-minded, and we fail to realize that there would have been Magi, like I said, and the Kushan is an Indian empire, and then the Han dynasty in China. There would have been Magi in those courts as well. And there's another theory that I'm working on. I don't usually put it out publicly because I can't prove it. So this is just, conjecture, right? Which is that, we talked earlier about the number of the Magi, right? That the Christmas Carol says, "We three kings of Orient are," right? Well, that's the tradition based upon the gifts. There were three gifts, so we made up this tradition that there were three wise men. But based upon what we now know is the job description of the Magi, that they were the lower house of Parliament. They were very powerful, knowledgeable men, the movers and the shakers of their day and time. They interpreted dreams. They read the stars. And here you go. They oversaw royal succession. That's their job.
That's power.
That's power. And well, see, not only is it power, but look how it connects to the nativity. Yeah. Right? Because seeing this wasn't Herod's first run-in with the Magi. Okay, this isn't the first time he ever encountered a Magi in his life. Here it is. It's the exact same thing. We always think Western. We always think Western culture, Western civilization. Herod would have had trade with the East.
Mhm.
So he would have encountered the Magi before. It's not that they didn't know who these guys were.
Right.
It's just
Now,
it wasn't a surprise.
Now, Tim, the thing that I'm thinking of here is that you're telling me that these guys would appoint kings in certain areas and such. They did have some political power. So when these guys showed up in Jerusalem, it talks about there being a great uproar. To put it nicely, Herod must have been, well, beside himself. And so he must have been freaking out because these guys have some power.
Mm-hmm.
So when they're asking a rather benign question, I would think might have gone whew, because they were asking about he who was born king of the Jews, and he may have been expecting to get overthrown, I guess.
Well, yes.
Am I on the right track here?
Absolutely. See, I don't think it was a benign question. I don't think it was a benign question at all. I think they knew exactly what they were asking because they would have known that Herod was a Roman appointee, and they knew that their job was overseeing royal succession. So they marched right into his court and said, by the way, where's the real king?
So they would be really the only ones who could just march right in because they're like, oh, they're here. Come right in.
Yeah. Michael, I know you want to add something. Go for it.
Go ahead.
No, I was just listening, and I didn't have too much to add other than, yes, I think his mind was completely blown. And I was laughing because there's a colloquialism that I will not use, but I'm sure he was freaking out completely because when these guys show up, you're like, oh, no. Yeah. And there's nothing that they're going to say to you that's not going to have consequences attached to it.
Exactly. And then seeing part of the backstory, because here's the other part. Most of us don't know the backstory. Okay. When Herod was appointed king of Judea by the Romans, Rome did not control Judea.
Right.
Parthia did. So the Romans gave Herod 11 Roman legions to go drive the Parthians out of Judea. And it took him 3 years to do it militarily. Okay. And he drove the Parthians out. Okay. So this isn't the first time that Herod's been at war with the Parthians.
Got it.
So this is in the and like you and I were talking about this on the phone earlier today, that Herod, because he was a Roman appointee, right? And he married Judean royalty, his wives and children have a better claim to the throne than he does. So he was a very paranoid man that spent his entire career defending his throne against all challenges. This is exactly why my project is called God Save the King. That's where I got the title from, is because Herod would kill any threat to his throne. Right?
So that's why he put the order out to kill all the young boys 2 years old and younger.
Precisely because the Magi, who are king makers, that's what they do, marched into his court and said, where's the real king? Right? And because he's already been executing other threats to his throne, this is totally in keeping with Herod's character. It's like, and he says he called the Jewish scholars and said, okay, so where's the prophecy that the Messiah is to be born? Right. Oh, Bethlehem. Okay, cool. Black ops troops. Okay, great. Quick and quiet. You go to Bethlehem, you kill every kid.
Yeah. He did what strong men do. He ruled with force and violence and the threat of, you will die if you do not listen to me and do what I say.
Yeah. Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Yeah,
right.
It's really interesting. I mean, the plot thickens and you can start to see the political climate 2,000 years ago, what was going on. And it just gives it a whole different flavor, doesn't it, guys?
Yeah, absolutely. Completely. And so now you have to add this to it, which is the fact that, like I said, the Parthian Empire begins when they break from the Greeks. The province of Parthia is on the southeast corner of the Caspian Sea, and the Parthian Empire consistently grows to the west, where they run into the Romans, who are moving to the east. And Israel is right smack on the frontier between these two superpowers. Okay. So, and they went to war. The Parthians and the Romans duked it out big time for the next 50 to 75 to 100 years after they encountered each other. At first, they didn't encounter each other right away because the dying Greek Empire was a buffer between them. But once the Greek Empire crumbled completely, the Parthians and the Romans just went at it, right? So, like I said, when Herod was appointed king of Judea by the Romans, Rome didn't have it to give. So they armed him and gave him legions to go drive the Parthians out, which he does, right? So now Herod administrates Judea for Rome for the next 35 years. And then, lo and behold, the Parthians read the stars and they discover that the new king of the Jews, which is their job, is born in Bethlehem of Judea. So they send an official ambassadorial entourage to Jerusalem and Bethlehem to worship the new king of the Jews. But they're not stupid. They're going into Roman territory. They are entering foreign enemy territory, which means they would have had military escort.
So, Tim, continuing along that thought, I've read things, heard things that there could have been 3,000 or more people walking into Jerusalem that day.
Correct. Now, I don't think they would have necessarily walked into Jerusalem. Okay, but your theory is not incorrect, right?
Okay.
Your hypothesis is correct. I'm just talking about the details of how it would have went down, right? I think because also, I'm aware of the reason Herod had to drive the Parthians out of Judea is just prior to that, Rome was actually starting to control Judea and the Parthians invaded and drove the Romans out. Okay. And we'll tell that story at it's a fabulous story. We'll do it on a different episode, right? So the Parthians invade. And now Herod is given this army to go drive them out, right? Like I said, okay? Rats. So what I was going to say is that, I know the details of how the Parthians invaded. I know what direction they came from, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, when they invaded Judea at that time. So I have to imagine that when they visited Herod, they kind of went based upon what had worked before. Right. So once again, because to travel with an army, and in that region, right, they would have had roads. They didn't just go across country. They didn't just take off straight across. They would have followed the roads. The
Romans built this incredible road system that still is existent today.
Right, exactly. So that's why I believe they would have followed the Euphrates northwest to Rasafa and then pick up the King's Highway and down through Damascus to Caesarea and then Jerusalem, is because they were following the roads and they're moving an army. Mm-hmm. They're moving an army, right? So when it talks to estimating numbers, right? Because you said 3,000, I think it was twice that.
About 6,000.
Yeah, I think it's more 6,000 to 7,000. And then the point I was going to make a few minutes ago is that I usually don't share this publicly because this is completely conjecture, right? Okay. But there are a couple of sources that are kind of hinting at it, that maybe it went down this way, which is that the Parthian army may have been accompanied by an Indian army and a Chinese army.
Interesting.
And if that was the case, the number was probably closer to 25,000.
So how long would it take these guys to get into where they needed to be? Is that an all-day process then?
Well, because what I think what would have happened is if they took the route that I believe they took, right, they would have come down from the north. That's kind of the whole point, right?
Yeah.
Is they're coming down from the north, and the army would have stopped shy of the city and encamped.
Got it.
You don't bring the whole army into the city. You drop the army off, and then you send the ambassadorial entourage into the city. Right?
The Romans did the same thing. They're notorious for
Correct, exactly. And then here's another fun little detail that I don't get to mention very often, right? Is that See, I think what happened is once they hit Rasafa and the King's Highway, and now they're going southwest, right?
Right.
When they get to Damascus, Damascus was administrated for the Romans by Herod. Okay? So that's when I think Herod found out that they were on their way.
And he starts losing his mind. His mind is doing, gymnastics, trying to figure out what's really going on.
Exactly. Well, one of two or three things would have happened, meaning that either the Parthians would have sent advance riders themselves announcing that an ambassadorial entourage was on the way, or Herod's own network would have said, oh my God, there's a Parthian army in Damascus. We've got to warn Herod. And then they would have sent riders south to Caesarea and Jerusalem to warn the king, right?
Mhm.
But the reason I bring up Damascus, right, is for a very particular reason, which is that when the Romans conquered Damascus, they totally remodeled the city according to Roman architecture, right? And one of the things the Romans always did is they always made sure there was at least one street in the city that could handle an army, that would be big enough and wide enough and paved, right? That it
because they're taking care of their own interests.
Because they're taking care of their own interest, right? That street in Damascus is mentioned in the Bible. It's called the street called Straight in the book of Acts.
Got it.
If you look at the ancient city of Damascus, that road is still there today. And then also the eastern gate of Damascus, I've got a picture of it because it's the modern version. So it's not exactly like it was 2,000 years ago, but the eastern gate of Damascus is still standing. Okay.
Wow.
And when you look at the eastern gate of Damascus, the main gate is like 40 feet wide. So that's big enough for cavalry and wagons and camels and all that stuff. And then on either side of it were two smaller gates that were about 20 feet wide. And that's where all the infantry would have walked through, right? And one of the records that I have, and like I said, once again, disclaimer, I usually don't do this publicly because it's a little bit on the conjecture side, that it says that when they traveled through this gate, the eastern gate of Damascus, it took them from before sunrise until after noon.
Wow. So that's like 6-7 hours then.
Yeah.
Or more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So this was a very large entourage and accompanying military escort. And then, so like we said, I think they stopped shy of the city. So then they pulled into Caesarea and then down to Jerusalem. I think the army itself would have stopped outside, and then the entourage would have went into the court.
So
but that
just
probably
to kind of sum up, we have guys who 800 years roughly before Daniel was appointed their head. He passed on a lot of the Jewish traditions and everything having to do with the astronomy. They had their own. They've been looking at the sky and looking for a certain sign. They see something that tells them, pack the bags, we're going to Israel.
Right.
And that's where we're at. And so I've always thought that it really couldn't have been a comet that they saw, because comets don't really stay in the sky that long. Yeah. And for them to make that trip, they'd have to be tracking something that would stay in the sky for months.
Exactly.
So that would have to be a planet or something like that, because they were really big into looking at the movement of planets and electrograde motion and all this other stuff. So what is it they were looking at?
Okay, well, so back to my theory, right? So one theory is that they knew Judean archaeoastronomy passed down to them from Daniel, right?
Right.
But what I'm also exploring was, did that overlap with how Babylonian astronomy was understood, right? Because if the two overlapped, now you've got, no wonder they were like, oh my God, this is amazing. We have to go right now. So one of the preeminent ways that Babylonian astronomy worked was that they recorded the heliacal rising of certain stars above the horizon prior to the sun coming up. Okay. And what that means is helios is the word for sun. So the heliacal rising of a star, which is part of, by the way, that's exactly what they're talking about in Matthew chapter 2, verse 1, we have seen his star in the east. That is referring to the heliacal rising of a star.
So this would be, just not to interrupt, but just to make a clarification. Sure. Venus is notorious for rising early in the morning, 4:30. Sun isn't up yet. It's not sunrise. And it's a bright and morning star mentioned in the Bible. It's also out in the early evening. So this is exactly what you're talking about, correct?
Right. So, yeah. And then, so in the Babylonian tradition, there is a record known as the Enuma, Anu, and Enlil. Okay. So the Enuma, Anu, and Enlil is a collection of 70 clay tablets that is now on display in the British Museum in London. It's all cuneiform tablets, and it records, it's their Bible. It's their astronomical interpretation Bible. Okay. And the centerpiece, for lack of a better term, of the Enuma, Anu, and Enlil is the Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, which is this one tablet that records all the heliacal risings of the planet Venus. And I think they also recorded the heliacal risings of Jupiter as well, but which makes either Venus or Jupiter or both really predominant candidates for what it was they saw. Oop, we lost your audio there, Kevin.
Can you hear me now?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah. So you must have had a conjunction, perhaps, of like maybe Venus and Jupiter, some of the brighter stars. And if they come together, they look like, to the naked eye, one star, two merging or three merging into one. And the amount of light then that's concentrated is enormous.
Yes. Yeah.
And it gets your attention.
Yep. I don't have the date memorized, but there was a conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. If I remember correctly, it was in June of 3 BC.
Yeah.
That would have been just absolutely stunning, because they were so close together that, like you said, the combination would have looked like one star. And if you were an observer, if you were an astronomical observer, then of course you would have been watching these two stars over several days go bang, right? And then once that happens, you're just like, oh my God. So there's no question that the Magi would have seen that as a significant omen.
Yeah. Now I have just a few minutes left. I know that the date that I've come across for years is that Jesus was born on September the 11th, 3 BC. When we look at the Gregorian calendar, how does that date hold up, guys? Michael?
Well, what Tim was just describing with the two planets in June, I mean, that works out great, right? Because you see this in June and you start moving towards it. And then if he's born in September. So, I mean, when I first heard this, like a lot of people, I mean, I grew up with the Christian myth, as Tim calls it. And it's this really simplistic, you know, what's the things that we shake up with the snow? And it's that kind of,
and by the way, I got, let's see, I got about 3 minutes. So,
okay, let me just wrap this up. So anyway, I think that Tim's description of this being 3 BC 9/11, I think it's completely plausible. I do think that the Magi saw some kind of a conjunction. I agree with you on that. And I think these were planets versus stars, not a comet, not a fast-moving asteroid or meteoroid or anything like that. Something that they had time to notice and go, this is worth looking into.
Yeah. And I think also the part of the sky that it was operating in, because from some of the things that I've learned, where it is in the sky and what constellation it's in is a big deal.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So, final thoughts, Tim, final thoughts, Michael. Michael, go back to you. What are your final thoughts on this subject?
My final thoughts on this, and Tim and I discussed this, it's like, listen, I love Christmas. Tim loves Christmas. It's my favorite time of the year. So no one's trying to take the air out of the enjoyment of that holiday. This is just an expansion of information that's pretty important. And so I guess I would just want to stress, listen, we're not here to ruin Christmas. It's just we're trying to impart some information that we believe is fundamentally important. And I thank Tim for bringing me into that conversation, because I did not know it before I met him.
Yeah, and Michael, I think it adds to and makes it even more significant when you know the real facts versus the mythology. It
I
makes
think it makes
more
it a lot
real,
more plausible.
more plausible and more gives it greater depth. I
And
think
more
there's a lot more depth.
context.
Context, yeah, is very, very good. And Tim, what are your final thoughts?
Well, what I would bring up is this, which is that my goal, like Michael said, my goal in God Save the King is not to ruin someone's party. That's not really what I'm after here. All I'm really trying to do is tell the nativity story as the Bible tells it and what it really would have looked like. It's just unfortunate that over the years, the traditional story became so predominant.
Yeah.
And it's just unfortunate that it's just factually just not accurate. I'm just trying to tell the story the way it really would have looked. And if you watch pretty much any, television documentary about any famous figure, pick your historical figure.
Yeah.
Somewhere at the beginning of that documentary, they're going to say, oh, the tradition or the legend or the myth goes like this, ABC, but in reality, it probably looks more like this.
Yeah.
XYZ. And that's all I'm really doing here is I just simply want to tell the story the way it happened, because number one, I think it's an amazing story that we're missing out on for one thing. And also, of course, I think it brings greater glory to God.
And very quickly, you have a radio show that runs on the Truth Be Told radio network. Tell people a little bit about the show, when it's on, and how they can tune in.
Very good. It's called God Save the King. It broadcasts every Friday night at 10 p.m. Eastern on the Truth Be Told radio network. And it's all about what we're talking about tonight. It's just that I take the opportunity to go much slower and go much more in depth about all the evidence that I have researched over 30 years that has led me to the conclusions that I have regarding what this story really would have looked like.
That's pretty amazing when you think about how convoluted things got. And as you say, the mythology, when you take away that veneer and you look at exactly what was really going on at the time, I think it makes things far more real. And I'm trying to search for the right word that I have here, but something you're going to appreciate far more than what we've been given as reality.
Yeah.
And that's really the thing that I'm looking at. And I mean, we've only really scratched the surface here, and we haven't really gotten into too much of it at all. We're going to have at least 2 more shows covering different aspects of this topic, folks, over the next couple of weeks. So you're going to want to tune in again and check out what we're doing here with Tim and with Michael, and as we kind of really explore and expand on this subject. And folks, I'm Kevin Gallagher for Tim Kynes and for Michael Parker. I thank you so much for joining us here on the program tonight. As always, you can catch us every Friday night, 8:30 p.m., every Monday morning at 11 a.m., Channel 23 in Connecticut. You can watch us online. You can go to timeoutyoutube.com. You can also listen to the program. That's without all the video. You can listen to it on the Truth Be Told radio network. We play the show 9 p.m. Eastern time on Friday evening, so you can hear the show. And I really do thank you for joining us. Please tune in again next week to see what it is we'll be talking about. Until then, hey, have a great night.